Welcome to the mysterious world of Angel of Death, where every shadow hides a secret and every soul has a story. Vanessa Hunt's journey has just begun, and your journey has just begun. Join us as we explore the unknown depths and unravel the mystery. This is EP6 of Angel of Death. Thank you very much for your likes and subscriptions. You can express your opinions in the comments section. Chapter 21, It All Goes Down. I stayed with Daniel for at least a couple of weeks. Daniel wanted to immediately go out and tell everyone he was with Vanessa Wellington. He spoke of renewing our engagement. Daniel, you're going too fast, I said. How the heck did you even know it was me? I knew it was you the very first day I met you at Steven's party. There was something about you that was so familiar. He said you said everything exactly the same. Guess I gave myself away, I said. But I had to know for certain, said Daniel. So I followed you after Steven's dinner. He raised his hand in front of me. I know how creepy that sounds, Vanessa, believe me. But what would you do if you lost the only woman you ever loved? And realized that she came back, I smiled. The earnestness in which he said it and the handsome look on those blue eyes was priceless. That's my Daniel. I guess that explains why you were there when I fought with Rina. Yes, I saw everything you saw me fight, yes. There is still so much I don't understand, Vanessa. But I would imagine that coming back from dead doesn't come free. I won't press you for answers for now. I am just happy I have you back well somewhat. That is okay, Daniel. But what made me sure about all this was the test. The test, Daniel nodded. The night I found you all bloodied, after we had treated your wounds, I decided to place you in Shelley's room, I said. I was wondering about that. Vanessa Hunter was the only other person who's been allowed into that room. Daniel smiled. Exactly. And the way you looked around Shelley's room, at her trophies, your eyes went from trophy to trophy. Your eyes had a far-off look, like you were lost in memory. Your eyes went from her swim medals in order of when she won them. You weren't reading what each trophy was. You were remembering them when you did that. I was convinced it was you, even when you were trying to hide it. You were obvious, he continued. Ordering the broiled redfish at Broussard's was completely something you would do to be mean to me, he said with a smile. Oops, I said, smiling at him sheepishly. I deeply enjoyed those precious few days I spent with Daniel. We took time to catch up with each other, even taking time to frequent old haunts. We steered clear of both Broussard's and the old Absinthe House, however. We didn't want to draw unwanted attention to ourselves. Mostly, we stayed home and just spent time with each other. So I almost regretted it when the day finally came for me to deal with a situation I had been hoping would come a lot later. Vanessa, Daniel's voice startled me awake one morning. I bolted upright, wondering what it was that made him so anxious, and looked around. The rays of the sun filtered through the windows of the room we shared. Vanessa, this is bad. Your face is all over the news. My what? Actually, it's both your faces. Come again. Daniel threw the paper at me. Read, he said. And while we're at it, let's turn on the television. Daniel was right. The paper had my face as the recently deceased chair of Hunter Robotics. The paper was sensationalizing it, of course. It talked about my death, about how Vanessa Hunter had struggled to maintain control over the company. It spoke of rumors of insider trading and possible criminal connections. No outright accusations, of course, but just enough to be able to say it. The next part talked about the mysterious Vanessa Wellington, an heiress who appeared out of nowhere, who has mysteriously been making a lot of money shorting the company shares. The paper pointed to Haley as the source of the rumors. The article was lengthy, and I had to hand it to the paper. They did a really good job of painting this their way. The front page had photographs of both Vanessa and Haley side by side. The old me versus the new me. I had to smile at that comparison. My mother had put her plan into action. It's okay, Daniel, this is part of the plan, I said. What? How is an insider trading scandal like this part of the plan? Vanessa, look, Daniel said, pointing at the television where Vanessa Wellington's face was prominently displayed. If you aren't careful, the SEC could begin looking into your activities. The reporters are already whipping this into a media frenzy. Besides, shorting your own company makes very little sense. I sighed and got up, pulling the white sheets close to me as I went into the bathroom to shower. Daniel followed me into the bathroom. I dropped the sheets and stretched. So who's got the hotter bod, Haley or Vanessa? I asked, smiling as I looked back at a red-faced Daniel. I'm sorry, Van, he said as he averted his eyes, looking down at the floor. No worries, I said with a wink. I'm just having a little fun with you. I stepped into the shower and turned it on. The hot water jetted out and hit my skin. The heat was comforting. I was reminded of the time I spent with Gregor and the brood. I quickly brushed the thought aside. This is he won't look into me, I said as I turned the showers off and pulled a towel from the nearby rack. Excuse me, the SEC, you were worried about them. I have it all under control, and shorting Hunter Robotics is part of my plan. But why? I sighed. There are many things that you are better of not knowing, Daniel. This is one of them. I just don't want to lose you a second time, Van. You know that my heart softened at that. It's quite all right, Daniel. This is something I have to do. But believe me, we will have plenty of time to catch up when this is all over. What, this is all over? What the hell does that mean? My phone rang in the bedroom. I rushed out to grab it. Perfect timing. It was Death calling. I picked it up immediately. And how is the honeymoon, Sherry? He asked. And I couldn't tell if he was joking or sincere. He somehow sounded sad. But maybe it was just my imagination. Don't tell me you called just to find out. You did wait 2 weeks before calling, alas. It takes a while to recover from a broken heart. He said, okay, but you didn't call just to tell me that. You're right, Sherry, I didn't listen. You need to be in Chicago at Hunter Robotics. Same time tomorrow. I just got a call from Robert Mayer. The board is taking an emergency vote. You'll need to find a way to let yourself in. I know everything now, Vanessa. I found your mother and she's explained everything. Your strategy is a good one, but we have to be very careful about playing our cards right. Wait, how did you? Stopped and shook my head. Never mind, I said. Your death, infinite resources. Sherry. I could almost picture the big grin on his face as he said the words. How I wish sometimes you'd let me in on those so I wouldn't have to do things the hard way. But it's so much more fun to see Vanessa Hunter in action. Funny, you are fine. I'll meet you in Chicago, I said. The atmosphere at Hunter Robotics was highly charged by the time I got there. I pulled up in front of the all-too-familiar building. The outside of the building was already chaotic. Members of the press were already there in a media frenzy. It wouldn't do for any of them to see Haley Wellington walk through the door. I parked my car a block away, got off, and invoked the nether void. I had gotten quite good at it. I knew I would at least be able to invoke it for a block or so. More than enough to allow me to get past the press without attracting attention. I had to try very hard to make it look as though it was the first time I had ever set foot in the building. No small feat either. There were too many memories within those walls. The decor was beautiful. Long offices with sweeping floor plans. Lots of open space that featured pastel colors, orange and white and green. Eye-catching. Just the right mix to attract the sharpest young minds in Chicago. But I already knew that, of course. This wasn't Donnie Hunter's thing. Donnie had always focused first and foremost on the research. It was Vanessa Hunter who had made the changes, getting rid of the cubicles in favor of the open spaces. It was Vanessa Hunter who flattened the chain of command, ensuring that employees' voices could filter through the ranks free of judgment. Bosses that stifled ideas had no place at Hunter Robotics. Rather, it was the managers who understood that everyone had something to contribute that did well. It was something that I was proud of to this day. I checked myself into the reception area and tried very hard to pretend I didn't know each and every employee. As chair of Hunter Robotics, HR gave me a file on everyone who worked for us. I read those files on a daily basis, sometime around 11:45 p.m. With an open bottle of Pinot Noir, I would pour over the files of everyone who ever worked for the company that I loved. I felt just the slightest twinge of regret. I realized just how much of Hunter Robotics was in my blood, exactly how much I loved it and yearned for the life that I had left behind. It made me angry, of course, that it was the man I trusted more than my own life itself who had betrayed me. I took the elevator to the penthouse suite. It was more or less part of my daily ritual. I would get up at around 4 in the morning, get a cup of coffee brewing and hop onto the treadmill for half an hour while the news would play in the background. Then it was off to a half-hour breakfast meeting. I would insist on a very early one at 5:30 in the morning. I vetted my business opportunities that way. Anyone who didn't have the dedication to meet for breakfast at 5:30 in the morning wasn't worth doing business with. I would be in the office by 6:15. I loved my job dearly. The elevator took its time and I found myself lost in memory. The cold steel doors of the elevator opened shortly after we reached the penthouse suite. Death was waiting for me at the entrance. "You'd best have a good plan, Sherry," he began. "This is serious business if I didn't have a plan D." I began. "I wouldn't have set things into motion like this." "Why then? Does this feel like the time we met that bitch Azazel?" "Relax," I said, laughing. "I've better control over businessmen than I do demons." "I hope you're right," Death whispered. "There is a lot of hostility toward you in there." "Haley Wellington part of the plan," I said. "Is my mother here?" "She's already in the boardroom," said Death, "as is Robert Mayer." He gestured toward the open office with the long oval boardroom table. "They've been expecting you, Haley." "Okay, D," I said. "Follow my lead this time, okay?" Death bowed to me just then. "It would give me no greater pleasure," he said in a low voice, "than to see the great Vanessa Hunter in action." I smiled at that and confidently strode into the boardroom. The room was quiet as I entered. I looked around me at the familiar faces. Even the long cherry boardroom table had been selected by Vanessa Hunter. Everything from the televisions that filled the room, all hyper-connected so I would have all the information I needed at my fingertips. Cisco spider phones were at each end of the table, and at varying intervals all throughout. I didn't skimp on technology that empowered communications. Still, the group that greeted me as I walked in was decidedly somber. They all sat down collectively as I walked in. "Looks like I'm the woman of the hour." I looked at the faces around me. My mother nodded without smiling in acknowledgement. Yes, but not one that would draw any suspicion. Robert Mayer took his place at the head of the table as the rightful CEO of Hunter Robotics. I knew each and every board member. I knew what I needed to appeal to. I needed to sell Haley Wellington. But far more than that, I desperately needed to sell Haley without drawing unwanted attention from the SEC. As Daniel put it, that was one group that I did not want attention from. "You've read the news, no doubt," I said. "This company is reeling and I have decided to short the company shares for profit. You do realize, Miss Wellington, that we will not sit idly by as you profit from the ruin of a company that has taken over 2 decades to build." It was Gordon Beckett speaking. Wonderful words from an exceptional businessman. Gordon was one of my personal choices. He had incredible business knowledge coupled with a very ethical approach to doing business. He was a Vanessa Hunter favorite. Profit from a company's ruin. "That sounds almost rhetorical of you, Gordon." A voice spoke up. I turned around in surprise. Stephen Rutherford had made his entrance. My heart beat faster. All the players were assembled in the room. Would all this go according to our plan? Stephen calmly walked over to an empty seat and sat down without a word, content to let the remaining board members wonder just what it was that he was up to. I wanted to speak next, but I was interrupted. "Well, what a lively group of people we have gathered here." I cringed. I almost facepalmed at that moment. Death had let himself into the room with quite possibly the biggest grin I have ever seen on his face. I shot him a look that said, "What the hell are you doing?" But Death casually strolled toward me, taking the unoccupied seat next to me. He leaned toward me with a smile before whispering, "Making things interesting between you and I, Sherry." Chapter 22. Things get interesting. I raised my hand. "Yes, Miss Wellington," Gordon Beckett asked, when I wasn't present to preside over board meetings as I normally did in the past. Gordon typically stepped in as moderator at many of these board meetings. An older gentleman in his 70s. He had graying hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and a tough demeanor. He had been a tough guy in his older days, and the glasses were an almost contradictory component of his physical appearance. A distinguished face framed intense gray eyes. He was the perfect moderator and one of Vanessa Hunter's strongest allies in the Hunter Robotics board. There was still a lot of fire in the old man. "I really don't think it's a good idea for Mr. Grimm to be present at this meeting," I said. "Why, Ms. Wellington?" Death exclaimed with a smile. "I'm hurt." "I agree with that observation," said Stephen Rutherford. "Richard Grimm has no reason to be here. He is not a stakeholder. I am looking after my client's best interests," said Death, the smile still on his handsome face. I could only imagine how distracting it must be for others to have someone like him in the room. Beautiful to look at, but completely annoying when he wanted to be. I scanned the boardroom. looking for signs of agreement or disagreement, but the rest of the faces remained impassive. Robert sat there with a bemused expression on his face. I looked to my mother, but her face was emotionless. Astrid Hunter had her game face on besides. As Stephen's wife, she really didn't have much of a say in the matter. Stephen had managed to bring her in as a matter of convenience. But like Death, she did not have a real seat at the table. So to speak, Mr. Grimm, said Gordon Beckett. Unless you can prove otherwise. It appears your client does not approve of your involvement at these proceedings. This is a matter for majority shareholders as well as those who we perceived are threats to the organization. Gordon's voice trailed as he trained his intense eyes on me. It was a rather unnerving situation. To be playing at opposite ends to Gordon. He had been a powerful ally for many years today. He was a terrible adversary still. He wouldn't be for long. I knew how to use this to my advantage. I smiled sweetly at Gordon. This is business. Gentlemen, I said. I profited from shorting the company. It isn't a crime besides. We have yet to settle the matter at hand. I finished, pointing to Death. You're not going to make this easy on me, Sherry. He whispered and winked at me. Not unless you tell me what you have planned. I muttered under my breath. Death lifted a finger. As it turns out, I do have a perfectly valid reason for being here. Other than my client's best interests. And whatever could that be, asked Gordon Beckett. Death sighed and smiled again. Well, as it turns out, I have a small controlling interest in Hunter Robotics. That's bullshit, Grimm, and you know it. Stephen exploded in anger. I saw my mother gently tap him on the shoulder to restrain him. I'm afraid not, said Death. This is absurd. I said yes. Quite so, said Robert Mayer. We know who our large shareholders are. Richard Grimm has less than a 0.2 ownership stake. And we made sure to keep it that way. Death smiled in his affable, easy manner. If he had the fedora on, I was sure he would have most certainly tipped it toward the group. Yes, as matter of fact, you are all correct, Mr. Grimm. The board tires of your theatrics and you are wasting everyone's time. Unless you can prove otherwise. Please step out of the boardroom, Gordon. Always the charmer, said Death. Be that as it may. You will find, he said, turning to Robert with a smile, that a certain institutional investor, Reaper Holdings Inc. possesses an 8.63% ownership stake in Hunter Robotics. And if I'm not mistaken, he paused, snapping his fingers. Oh, that's right. That's about the same size as the ownership stake Mr. Rutherford has accumulated during his recent buying spree. Reaper Holdings Inc. is an offshore investment fund headquartered in the Caymans. We are well aware of who they are. Reaper Holdings is under my ownership, said Death. A shell company, so to speak. Reaper Holdings, huh? I said with a smile. You are just so creative with your names. Death coughed and cleared his throat. Well, you see, Sherry, he started. Never mind, I said, cutting him off. Mr. Grimm, we are going to validate your claims. So for the time being you may stay. Be that as it may, however, that also means you just betrayed your client by betting against her. That is in very poor taste. He does that a lot. And he does do many things in poor taste, I said. The look on Death's face was priceless. Death lifted a finger again. You'll find that everything I say checks out perfectly. And that despite what it looks like. I am still looking after my client's best interests. We'll let it slide for now, Richard, said Gordon Beckett. For the moment. We will now continue with the matter at hand. The entire room now turned its attention toward me. I felt all the angry stares and the hostility toward me. Did you start the rumors about Hunter Robotics, Ms. Wellington, asked Gordon Beckett. Are you responsible for the damaging leaks to the media? All of which, by the way, are baseless. No, I said. I wasn't lying anyway. It was my mother's doing. But no one would suspect Stephen Rutherford as the source of the leak. He was betting against me after all. And buying instead of selling. Hard to believe, Ms. Wellington. Considering your first short order came just a few days before the rumors began. It was Cheryl Donahue speaking. Cheryl was a high-powered attorney and named partner at Donahue, Harding and Gibson, one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago. She acted as legal advisor for the Hunter Robotics board. A smart, prim and proper woman in her early 40s. She was an overachiever and a climber. A terrifying combination of ambition, intelligence, beauty and ruthlessness. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her in a bun. She was wearing a black shirt with the 2 front buttons unbuttoned provocatively. This was a woman who got what she wanted and was not afraid to do whatever it took to get it. Cheryl was flipping through a long-bound document. It was a list of transactions at Hunter Robotics. If I really wanted to maximize my profit, I answered, I would have timed my first short order after the rumors were in the paper. Perhaps you did that to throw us off your scent. Cheryl answered. Still, Death intervened. The fact that she didn't means it's tough to find wrongdoing on my client's account. Is she still your client, Mr. Grimm? Gordon Beckett wondered aloud. After all, you are betting against her, are you not? Death chose not to answer that one. The room was quiet all of a sudden. Well, said Robert Mayer, breaking the silence, unless there are any objections, I believe that in light of the threats we have here, we have few options. Robert stood up in that moment and began pacing the room. We are caught between 2 opposing forces. Robert gestured toward me. A powerful investor who has shaken the value of this company to the core. He stopped and motioned toward Death and Stephen Rutherford, and the 2 opportunistic gentlemen across me, who are seeking to mount a hostile takeover. Robert pursed his lips and put both his hands on the table as a show of power. I think it's clear we need to take defensive measures. Indeed, Robert, said Gordon carefully. Your words bear merit, but as members of the board, we must carefully evaluate Article 64 Paragraph 3 and decide if that is worth it. Article 64 Paragraph 3, said Death with a smile as he addressed Robert. Might that be where you take control of Hunter Robotics for a short time as majority shareholder? You'd best not be so flippant with the board, Mr. Grimm, said Gordon Beckett. We are not yet done with you. Death bowed with a smile. As you wish, Mr. Beckett. Does anyone in the room have any objections to Robert Meyer's proposal? Asked Cheryl. I, for one, believe this is in our best interests, at least temporarily. It would have been what Vanessa Hunter wanted. I was touched. I was always distrustful of Cheryl in the past. I always believed she didn't feel I earned my spot as chair. I thought she looked down on me because of my youth. Still, to know that she had given me a vote of confidence was comforting. Gordon raised his hand. All in favor of Robert Meyer's proposal, raise your hands. I looked around at the room, with the exception of Death, myself, and the Rutherfords. All hands were in the air. The decision was unanimous. I guess that settles it. Robert Mayer is now majority shareholder with a full controlling interest for temporary time. Robert smiled at the room. Thank you, everyone, for your faith in me, he began. As my first act as majority shareholder, I move for a buyback of all available shares outstanding, he said. Gordon nodded. That makes a lot of sense, he said. I also recommend that we sell majority ownership of the company to another buyer. The room was in an uproar. What do you mean by that, Robert? Cheryl demanded. I move to sell majority ownership of Hunter Robotics to Tanaka Pharmaceutical and facilitate a merger between the 2 companies. The door opened just then, and Rina Tanaka entered the room. Her powerful presence filled the room as it always did. She was as beautiful as ever, dressed sharply in a tight, form-fitting black suit, her dark eyes cold and glittering as she surveyed the entire room, before she finally rested her eyes at me. Hello, Haley, she said with a smile. It's been a while, hasn't it? Shall we play a game? Chapter 23. Things get worse. The Hunter Robotics boardroom was deathly quiet. The soft hum of the air conditioning in the room was the only break in the silence. I looked around the oval table at the members of the board, people who served as both my staunchest allies and my biggest challengers at the same time. I saw worry and concern on their faces. Gordon Beckett had a frown on his face. His lips were pursed, his hands folded together in front of him. I could tell he was deep in thought. Robert Mayer stood up and went next to Rina Tanaka as they both moved to the head of the table. My, what a rather interesting turn of events, remarked Death. He wasn't smiling then. Just the slightest hint of one, perhaps. But like everyone else in the room, he was probably wondering what happened. I sat in my chair glaring at Rina, but I didn't say a word. I was going to let this unfold for me first. I needed to gather information, find out what exactly this new situation meant for me. That Robert had betrayed us was evident, but I still couldn't figure out what his purpose was. It appears you have some explaining to do, Robert, said Gordon Beckett in a dry tone. Were you planning this all along? I think we should start by hearing what Rina Tanaka has to say, said Robert. I think we should start by hearing from Hunter Robotics CEO and majority shareholder. Robert Gordon insisted, did you betray everyone here? Were you involved in Vanessa Hunter's death? Those are some pretty tall accusations, Gordon. Robert responded, his eyes staring coolly into Gordon's. He leaned on the table, laying both hands flat on the surface. It looked like he was about to say something, but changed his mind all right. Robert shrugged before continuing. Since you so nicely insisted, Gordon, I will tell you. Robert began to pace the room again. It is my belief that this merger is in Hunter Robotics' best interests. Merging with a giant pharmaceutical conglomerate with advanced R&D capabilities like Tanaka will be a boon to our business. Robert paused as Rina Tanaka passed around a set of files for the board to review. She stopped as she got to Death and myself. Sorry. Board members only, she said with a smile. Well, that's certainly not a good way to treat a potential investor. I remarked, you're not an investor, sweetie. Rina responded in her thick Japanese accent. Robert began speaking again. We would gain access to vast amounts of resources. Far more than we would have normally had access to. With Tanaka's backing and wherewithal, we could take significant strides toward advancing the nanotechnology division of Hunter Robotics. So you want to turn Hunter Robotics into a biotech firm? Asked Stephen Rutherford. In a way, yes. Robert responded, but why keep this from your board? Asked Gordon Beckett. To get this to work and minimize exposure. I couldn't get your advice on this, I am sorry. Old friend, I realize how awful this might look. But I couldn't have done this any other way. There was loud knock at the door and one of the secretaries walked in. A young attractive woman dressed smartly in a conservative black and gray striped suit. I'm sorry for interrupting, she said. There is a Daniel Ashcroft here that says he has something important to say to the group. My heart stopped. No, Daniel, stay away. This wasn't already a precarious situation. But Daniel turning up at this time made it far worse. I've never doubted Daniel's corporate acumen or his presence of mind in most business settings. In fact, there were several times in the past when his sixth sense for business had come in handy for me. What worried me more was that when it came to matters that involved Vanessa Hunter, he was far more likely to jump to the wrong conclusion and equally as likely to utterly mess things up. Daniel walked into the room, and I could tell he was already impatient. I saw those beautiful blue eyes survey the room. He had to have known what was going on. Even without any cues from me, Daniel was no fool. I saw his eyes go from Robert Mayer to Rina Tanaka. I knew in that moment that he understood the significance of the situation, but I was entirely unprepared for his response. Ladies and gentlemen of the board of Hunter Robotics, Daniel began, and it was one of the things we had practiced long ago. Daniel and I had been groomed from an early age to say the right things. We knew that certain things were expected of us, that we had to behave in a certain way. I fought those expectations a lot harder than Daniel did back in the day. After all, he had siblings. The situation for a firstborn son of the Ashcroft dynasty was different from mine. He had big shoes to fill, and his job was a lot harder than mine. Donovan Hunter was hardly a household name when I was growing up, but the Ashcroft's name was a lot to live up to. A name with a heavy burden attached to it still. It was clear Daniel was walking into a fire trap, a perfect combination of a situation he didn't understand and was ill-equipped to deal with, compounded by the fact that he was blind and vulnerable to the many individuals pitting their interests against each other. I couldn't blame him, however. Daniel had lost me once already, and the memory of that loss was far too close to home for him to easily forget. This weakness alone made him considerably easy prey for someone like Rina Tanaka. I wished to make a counteroffer, Daniel said finally. And my heart stopped. Daniel, I said, looking at him, hoping he could see the concern in my eyes. He looked at me sternly as if to tell me not to say another word. And I knew better than to argue with him. I shot a quick glance at Death and noted again just the slightest hint of a smile from the enigmatic being who had taken everything I had known and turned it on its head. I was annoyed, angry even, but part of me was impressed as always at how calm he was, even in the most dangerous of situations. Daniel Ashcroft, Gordon Beckett began. It is strictly out of respect for the association between Donovan Hunter and your father that we continue to tolerate this charade. he said in a monotone voice that did little to betray his emotions. And you young lady, he continued, addressing Rina Tanaka, have some nerve to just waltz in here and lay claim to a company that has taken a lifetime to build. No, Gordon Beckett said as he pounded his fist on the table. This board will not be bullied into submission, nor will it partake in the silly political finagling that is occurring at this moment. Had Vanessa, he paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. Had Vanessa been alive, she would have said, this is such bullshit, I said. The room erupted in an uproar. I knew you'd manage get yourself in trouble one way or another, Sherry Death remarked as he winked at me. All eyes were on me once again. My angry outburst had gotten everyone's attention big time. Still, I was hoping that the way I had said it would remind them of the old me, of Vanessa Hunter, the real leader and rightful owner of Hunter Robotics. I would have only once chance at this. I had the strangest feeling in my gut. My heart pounded as I realized I now had the biggest piece of the puzzle solved. Everything suddenly made sense. Listen, I know I'm the one person in this room that everyone distrusts universally. I said the words slowly, deliberately, doing what I could to hide the excitement I felt at the realization I had just reached. As the person shorting Hunter Robotics, I have the poorest bargaining chip right now. I'm all the way at the end of the table and everyone else is at least on the opposite side of that. I stood up and began pacing the same way Vanessa would. Come on, damn it, everyone recognize, remember. Realize who it is standing before you. I couldn't tell them outright, but I could certainly give them clues. Donovan Hunter founded Hunter Robotics with noble goals. To further the human race. To make things better for the common man over time. That goal has been muddied, things changed. The nanotechnology division began to take precedence over everything. Why is that? Donovan wanted to focus on miniaturization, said Robert. Donovan wanted to focus on something else. I responded I could feel the energy in the room. This was a highly charged situation and I was playing with fire at the moment. I needed to be careful with this. If I played my cards wrong, I could end up turning this into a dangerous situation for everyone in the room. My heart raced and I struggled to stay focused. I ask only for a favor and then I promise you, Haley Wellington will bow out of the race, and will henceforth cease my involvement with Hunter Robotics. What is the favor you are asking of the board? Gordon Beckett's calm and resolute voice cut through the uproar. I wish to speak to Robert Mayer alone. 5 minutes is all I need. There was silence as the board deliberated on my request. I looked around the room. It didn't take long for the board to make up their minds. I saw people nodding heads. As odd as my request was, I knew it would work after all. Everyone was unanimous in their desire to get rid of Haley Wellington. My mother's plan continued to work brilliantly, even past what we had originally planned for. Very well, Ms. Wellington, you shall have your 5 minutes and then some. The board will break for recess and reconvene in 10 minutes. I looked around the room as the board members got up, dumbfounded. I saw curious looks on their faces as they passed me. Rina Tanaka glowered at me as she passed, but I knew there was nothing she could do. I smiled back at her with all the charm I could muster. I noted a look of concern on my mother's face and I smiled at her to reassure I knew what I was doing. Daniel looked at me grimly as well, but I shook my head to let him know everything was going to be all right. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Death, who was last to leave the room. Hope you know what you're doing, Sherry. Still, I will be here waiting in case you need me. Death walked slowly and closed the door finally behind him. It was finally time. Robert and I were alone in the room. Robert looked at me with a puzzled expression on my face, and I smiled sweetly at him. I still remember the one day you took me out to Belmont Harbor. I said slowly it wasn't a typical day. I paused to point up at the sky. The skies were overcast. The day was ripe for a storm. It wasn't the usual trip for you and I. I stopped to look at Robert Mayer. Don't you remember? I think I was maybe 9 at the time, Ms. Wellington. I'm not quite sure I follow. Robert began. Looking back on it all, I said, ignoring what Robert said, I think that was one of the few times when I realized you changed. He paused again, waiting to see what effect my words would have. You said something to me back then that puzzled me. As the rain fell, and we continued to stay out at sea, the lightning flashing in the sky and the thunder rumbling as the waves rocked the boat angrily, I paused again as the anger in my voice continued to mount. You said the time had come for man to break out of his shell. I smiled once more at Robert. I'm afraid I don't. Robert tried to say something again, but I fully understand now what your words back then meant, I said, cutting Robert off before I walked right up to him, stared deeply into his eyes. It was you. It's always been you all along. You never left. I guess we finally meet again, Dad. Chapter 24. Donovan Hunter. I had so many fond memories of my dad. In fact, I could hardly ever recall any sad ones at all, other than the time when he passed away. The memory of seeing his casket, the dark wood that was polished to a gleaming sheen, an almost all too fitting metaphor for my father's passing. It was too painful for me to have to look into it, and so I didn't. I preferred to remember Dad as he was in life. That was probably one of the few I could recall. A lone memory, something that I had almost forgotten, that suddenly came bubbling to the surface. I forced myself to recall the strange day my father took me out to sea again, remembering the lashing storm, my father's recklessness, and all the while asking why he had chosen to take his daughter out to sea in the manner in which he had done. I was 9 and frightened, of course, but what 9-year-old doesn't trust their own father implicitly? I knew my dad would never let me come to harm. That day, I continued as Robert Meyer's eyes bored into mine. Were you trying to get us both killed? I asked, as I met his glare with one of my own. Were you trying to draw out the Van Dyke secrets by killing your own daughter then and there? A smile broke from Robert Meyer's face. His shoulders started shaking. I realized he was laughing hysterically. You are my daughter after all, Vanessa, he began. Tell me, how did you figure it out? There were a number of things that bothered me about the whole thing. First, why call Death and tip him off about the board meeting? I mean, Robert Meyer wasn't exactly fond of Richard Grimm, and Richard wasn't a big investor in Hunter Robotics. So there really was no reason for Death to be present at these proceedings. Only someone who knew more than an ordinary human would about Richard could possibly want anything to do with him. I clenched my fists. I was angry just then. I wanted to make him tell me why it was that he did all the bad things that he did. More importantly, why he made my mother suffer so much. I wanted an explanation for the mockery he made of the fond memories I had. So tell me, Dad, what exactly did you want with Death? Donovan Hunter smiled at me. I should have seen it coming. Everything about how he acted, the strength in which he exercised his power over the board, the way he leaned on the table in exactly the same way he did at every meeting I was present at. If I hadn't seen him in the boardroom today, I might still be in the dark about my father's whereabouts. I'll show you a little something, Vanessa, he said simply. Robert Meyer's face moved a little. It was hard to discern at first. It looked like a tiny portion of his chin was moving. Then it was an odd movement on his forehead. I soon realized what was going on. The nanomachines, I said as my blood chilled as if in response. I saw my father's face move and contort. It looked like Robert Meyer's face was overrun with a swarm of tiny black ants. Except I knew these weren't ants. They were literally thousands, perhaps millions of submicroscopic nanomachines whose collective movements could be seen but that were individually impossible to discern with the naked eye. The machines moved strategically at great speed, in a highly synchronized manner. That the machines were highly intelligent was clear. Such tactical coordination would not have been possible otherwise. My mother was right. My father's science had progressed to a level beyond anything possible in the current time. Our 14-nanometer machines had barely begun to walk, let alone coordinate with one another. All our machines could do was gather data at a blindingly fast rate and communicate that data across the world. Hunter Robotics' cutting-edge technology was an utter and complete dinosaur in comparison to the highly advanced, high-functioning ants that crawled around my father's face. You've integrated yourself with the nanomachines, I said. You've assimilated them into your bloodstream, made them part and parcel of who you are. That's how you achieved immortality. My father's face was now completely overrun with the ants. The machines continued to move at rapid rate. They filled me with a strange revulsion. The ants marched in a highly coordinated pattern, moving across my father's bone structure. Then I noticed the ants slowing down. The frenzy of their marching slowed as the machines began to put the finishing touches on their coordinate change. When they were finished, I found myself staring at Donovan Hunter's perfectly reconstructed face. You needed a way to achieve immortality while releasing yourself from your responsibilities. You needed to be unfettered from the mortal coil. I continued, so you killed your best friend, faked your death and took his place to think that I loved you dearly not so long ago, I said, tears coming to my eyes. To think that just a few weeks ago, I would have wanted nothing more than for us to be reunited like this. I whispered softly, I did not raise you to be so weak, Vanessa. I raised you to be a powerful woman, someone who was capable of everything and anything, a person who could take on my legacy as an active partner. Said Donovan. Was that why you killed me? I asked. How exactly did you go about killing me? Do the details really matter, Vanessa? Aren't you more interested in the why? Donovan paced the room, his hands behind him. I noticed he had grown taller too, and that even his suit grew to accommodate his larger frame. It was as if every single molecule in my father's body was a nanomachine, from his skin to the clothes he wore on his body. Well, allow me to humor you, he said with a smile. Just shortly after you and Daniel had your petty little squabble at the party, I found my opportunity. Daniel had just left the room to clear his head, and you were staring out the open window. All I had to do was come back into the party, using my nanomachines to disguise myself as Daniel, and give you a little push, you son of a bitch. I said angrily. You pushed me out as Daniel. Were you trying to get him to take the fall? Fortunately for Daniel, no one noticed, but it still made him the prime suspect. Understand this, it had to be Daniel, Vanessa. For my plan to work, I had to destroy both Ashcroft Pharmaceutical and Hunter Robotics. That alliance was too powerful. I had built it that way after all. It would not be a simple matter to dissolve such a carefully planned bond between the two companies. That alliance was going to be able to endure any attack I could mount from within unless the bond one created was significantly weakened. But why destroy both companies? To what end? The alliance was a matter of convenience. I took what I needed from Ashcroft, no more no less. Donald Ashcroft had far too much of a conscience, and Daniel even more so. Neither of them would have understood. I'm not sure I do, Dad, I said sadly. I'm not really sure you would understand, Vanessa. I thought you would have figured out by now why I faked my own death. I looked at him puzzled. It was all for you, Vanessa. Everything was about you from the beginning. Donovan pointed at me. His tall, imposing frame was impressive. He was a powerful man who looked every bit the part. When I figured out that Astrid had transferred her power to you, I thought she had won completely, and that I would never get the chance to learn more about the hidden secrets she had spoken of so much. It was by sheer luck that Astrid herself handed you over to me. I clenched my fists in anger. And you took such good care of me, I said. Donovan chuckled at that. Of course I did, Vanessa. You were after all my only daughter. Did you love me at all? I asked, as the hot tears came running down my cheeks and I stifled a sob, forcing myself to swallow the lumps in my throat that kept coming unbidden. Love is such a weak human emotion, responded Donovan. Not befitting the ultimate human being. Donovan raised a hand to his face and clenched it into a fist. I prefer strength, the power of not having any weaknesses. So it all went according to plan. Then I said no. Not quite, Vanessa, said Donovan. I miscalculated. I did not anticipate Death himself to step in. I became aware that Death was a real being only after he had stepped in to make you an offer which you surprisingly accepted. The bond between Daniel and yourself, love, was a powerful thing that bound you to this earth. I hadn't expected you to turn weakness into strength, Vanessa. If I hadn't accepted, what would have happened? I asked. I would have found a way to gain access to your soul and bind it for my purposes. I needed the secrets of the grimoire, Vanessa, and your mother refused to share it with me. I had to find another way, you see. It wasn't that I disliked you as a daughter. The time we shared was memorable for me, but my science came first, so now what? I accepted Death's offer, and there's nothing you can do to change that. I looked around me, noticing that the board had begun to come back in. But not a single person entered the boardroom. They all stood outside, transfixed, in perhaps horror and amazement, as they had all noticed that Robert Mayer was no longer in the room. I could only imagine what was going through their minds when they found themselves staring at a ghost they long believed to be dead. That's simple, said Donovan. My powers are absolute. Nothing in this world or the next can defeat my science. I killed you once, Vanessa, I can do it again. And no being, not even death himself, can tamper with my plans. It was enough for me, then and there, to make a decision I realized was running out of time. My father had already confirmed what my mother and aunt had told me about him. It was a difficult decision to make, to be sure. But I had been in this situation one too many times for me not to understand. There are always casualties in business and love, and in war. When making a choice between who lives and dies, one must choose the path that saves the most and hurts the least. It has always been the principle that has guided my actions. I clenched both my fists. I was sad and angry at the same time. But there was an even bigger concern now. I knew that the world was in grave danger, that everyone I knew could be hurt by the monster that stood before me if I didn't do anything. It was clear that Donovan would stop at nothing in his quest for power, that things like love and concern for other human beings was not something that was in him anymore. It may have been once, if my memories weren't all fake, but it was certainly all gone now. I knew what it was that I had to do. There was no other choice than to fight Donovan Hunter and defeat him before time ran out for the entire human race. Activate, I said as I unleashed my scythe. I didn't have time to be coy. I turned to my dad with all the ferocity I could muster. It ends here, Dad. I have come to take you down. Chapter 25, Science versus the Supernatural. The familiar rush of power coursed through me once more as I released my scythe. At this point, I realized the situation was difficult to contain. On the one hand, I had far too many innocents present on the field. Board members aside, there were also the real innocents to worry about. People who had come to do their jobs for the day, who weren't here to care about how Hunter Robotics stock price did. These were the people who came in to do their jobs so they could support their loved ones. Those who had to work hard for others. Not the people who ran the organizations with agendas of their own, but the ordinary heroes. The father who had 4 mouths to feed, who was struggling to make the mortgage and was forced to decide between that and his son's football jersey that he wanted more than anything else for his birthday. Or the single mother who worked a second shift at the nearby bookstore so she could make ends meet for her 4-year-old with special needs. Those were the people that I wanted to protect more than anything else. Collateral damage is the word most often used in a business setting to describe a situation where shit hits the fan and the stench has gotten so bad that the Department of Health has to be called in. In other words, a situation that can't be contained. Acts of God, storms, earthquakes, and other such calamities. The very things that an army of pencil pushers and number crunchers spend hours predicting but can never get right. I preferred to act on instinct when such things happened, largely because, well, logic has gone out the door anyway. My instinct told me that this was a situation that required action. My father was too far gone, and no matter how I looked back on the past, my memories couldn't be trusted. They were far too flawed to be based on anything in reality. I felt the weight of the scythe I held in my hand. There was a certain heft to it now, something that didn't come easily. I had experience now, and I had the powers of the Van Dyke chosen. Would such things be enough for me to take down the superior technology that my father had built? There was only one way to find out. I moved as quickly as I could, hoping that the element of surprise would aid me. Part of me regretted announcing my intent to attack, but no one can really plan these things perfectly, and I just had to go with things as they happened. I swung the scythe as swiftly as I could, invoking the nether void at the same time in such a tiny space. I knew death would be able to sense it the moment I activated it. Still, it wasn't as though I could rely on death to get involved at the right time. But I could certainly clue him in and hope that he had the sense to do what was right. Trust no one, Vanessa. Rely on yourself and focus on the outcome you want. Surprisingly, Donovan didn't bother to block the scythe. He stood there unmoving. My blade cut him diagonally, bisecting him from shoulder to hip. But Donovan continued to just stare at me and smile. I watched in horror as the ants raced around Donovan Hunter's body, reconstructing it, rapidly repairing the damage I had inflicted. Donovan Hunter laughed. As you can see, dear Vanessa, such things cannot harm me. My nanomachines have made me immortal and invulnerable. Part of me was expecting the difference in power, of course. After all, my father had years of experience, and he certainly had the technological advantage. But this level of sophistication was truly incredible. The nanomachines are self-repairing too, you know, said Donovan. If a machine dies, a new one sprouts in its place. The other nanomachines take the dead machine and reconstruct a new one using the remnants of the one that died. Donovan moved toward me rapidly, racing around the room at incredible speed, taunting me. I should not have been surprised that despite all the latent abilities I had at my disposal, Donovan Hunter still found a way to school me. He moved in quickly before I could even react, and took my scythe in his hand in the same manner Azazel had done, and played with it like a child would a toy, grabbing the blade with his fingers, and examining it closely. He chuckled. This is it. Vanessa, this is the extent of your so-called power. Perhaps I was mistaken about your potential after all. Starnos disvarta nos tardis, I said, unleashing a volley of magic that I had hoped would have the intended effect. A bright flash of light filled the room, and Donovan Hunter barely dodged the impact of the powerful blast I created. I didn't have time to think. I only prayed my recklessness didn't damage the building structure too much. My scythe might not be able to harm you, but the Van Dyke magic certainly can. Why else would you dodge that blast? Donovan Hunter's laughter filled the room. How very wonderful, Vanessa. You've never failed to impress me even back then. As a child, you always exceeded my expectations no matter how lofty they were. All I wanted was for you to love me, I said simply. You know the secrets of the grimoire, said Donovan. Tell me, Vanessa, how exactly did you happen to come by that knowledge? You're going to have to pry that one off my dead hands. I said. You conveniently forget, daughter of mine, that you're already dead, said Donovan. Very well. Then, it's time you realize that everything is futile. I detected a movement out of the corner of my eye, but it was too late. My reaction was far too slow. My father had moved into my blind spot, and before I knew it, his hands were at my throat. The pressure was too great and his strength was overpowering. The difference in power was too great. Even the demon Azazel could not have moved at such a blinding speed. Just when I thought I was about to pass out, I felt my father's grip loosen. I crumpled to the floor, my vision blurry for several seconds. As I steadied myself, I spied something that made me realize why my father had let go. It was death. He had let himself into the room and was now staring intensely at my father. I don't quite think I've ever seen him angry before, but in that moment, I could very easily tell that was the case. Death finally reveals himself to me, said Donovan. Be careful, mortal. Powerful technology you might possess, but in the end, mortal you still are. Donovan laughed heartily at that, a powerful, booming laugh that exuded confidence and power. Let's see you prove your point. I would like to participate as well. I recognized Rina's voice immediately. She entered the room walking slowly and confidently. She was carrying that dreadful sword again. Katsujinkan, the life-giving blade. The blade was black, curved in an arc. The sunlight glinted off the edge, giving it a far more sinister appearance in the light of day than when I saw it last under the cover of night. The sword that can cut souls without a color. A sword that could harm agents of death. The very sword that had nearly taken my life. Let me show you a neat trick as well, she said, laughing. I watched in horror as her elegant black suit dissolved into millions of swarming ants in a flurry of activity. The ants moved at great speed, reconstructing themselves around Rina's body. When everything was done, she was wearing a smooth, black jumpsuit with a hardened outer shell, the nanomachines forming an impenetrable exoskeleton around her body. A nanosuit, I said. Indeed, said Rina, smiling. Let's see how Death and his apprentice fares against the power of man's intelligence. What you see before you is the pinnacle of human achievement. Fear our wrath, agents of death. For today we end the vicious cycle of life and death. Today man becomes immortal. There was a sudden surge of energy around us. The ferocity of the surge took me by surprise, and I was flung from where I stood. I had the presence of mind to grab onto one of the walls. Had I not stopped myself, I might have been sent careening dangerously past the glass windows of the Hunter Robotics building. I knew what that surge of energy was, of course, but I hadn't quite seen it in this form, you know. You could have warned me before you did that, I said, smiling at Death, who had now unleashed his true form. Arrayed in his full glory, his massive, manifested form took up so much space. Where Donovan had previously been the most imposing figure in the room, he had suddenly been displaced. Death stepped forward, his black robes trailing the floor as he released his massive scythe. The purple hands were enormous, perhaps even more so than I remembered them to be. Death's massive scythe made Katsujinkan look like a child's toy in comparison. "Forgive me, Vanessa. I am a little angry at this mortal." Death turned to me with his hooded visage, and I was glad I could not see the skull behind it. I have never seen Death this angry before. His eyes glowed bright red in broad daylight. I braced myself for the inevitable battle. Both parties had laid their cards outright. This was not going to be a simple skirmish. I was already glad I unleashed the nether void, and that Death unleashed his powerful void on top of mine. I looked behind me at everyone, standing comfortably outside the glass windows of the boardroom, frozen in time, unmoving and unseeing. It certainly wouldn't do to have them witness the otherworldly battle that was about to ensue. I hear a loud laugh in the room. I realized it was my father's. "What could possibly be so funny?" I asked. "Why? We keep raising the stakes, my dear," he said. But this turn of events couldn't possibly have gone better for me. Not only do I have the bearer of the secrets of the grimoire before me, but I also have the opportunity to destroy the being that holds man back from becoming what he was meant to be," said Donovan. "Man was never meant to be immortal in his current state," said Death. "The moment Adam and Eve took the first bite, man was never the same after that. Man was never meant to find paradise on earth." There was a somber way in which Death had uttered those words that made me tremble. There was a loud crash, and I was hurled several feet again. I realized it was the sound of glass shattering all around us. Donovan had unleashed a powerful wave of force that rippled throughout the building. The shockwave surged throughout, causing the building to rock violently. I saw cracks on the surface of the smooth marble boardroom walls. "This is very bad." I saw the ants race around Donovan Hunter's body once more. They were forming something else, something intimidating. It looked as though a massive suit of armor was being built around Donovan. A black breastplate and thick armor now covered every part of my father's body. He sported wings now too, a massive wingspan that was easily 20 feet for each wing. His face was covered with a sophisticated helmet that made his appearance even more intimidating. It looked like a demon knight clad in black armor had come to face us. The windows have been blown all around the building. All that remains is the structure. "You'd better hope your nether void lasts for a while," chuckled Donovan. "Lose control for just the slightest bit and the people on this building all come flying out from the sheer force of physics. How long can both of you hold out in the heat of battle?" I wonder. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. "I guess only time will tell, you son of a bitch," I said. "To think that you would knowingly endanger the life of everyone in this building to play your selfish little game. Now Vanessa, let's not get carried away." Death's calm voice was soothing, comforting in this trying time. Death spread his arms wide as if to welcome the air that now blew fiercely from all around us. Yes, this is such a great day." He looked at me, his red eyes burning intensely, as he turned his attention to the two opponents we now faced. "Well then, everyone, shall we dance?" Chapter 26. Sticky Situation. As chair of Hunter Robotics, I have faced several trying situations before. At a time when most 16-year-old girls were struggling with such problems like who they should bring as a date to the school dance, or worrying about their score on the latest math test, I was fighting in the real world. I wasn't facing up to a bully who wanted to take my lunch money, or to peer pressure, or the endless high school gossip. True, much of that went on around me, I was sure, but I was too preoccupied with the real world to pay any heed to such paltry concerns. No, as a young girl of 16, my concerns were more about the stock value of the company that I was helming, and the fact that I was facing off against adults 3 times my age. People who were wiser, smarter, and far more ruthless than I was. Needless to say, I had to grow up in a hurry. The alarming situation had not been lost on me. The fact that Death and I faced what was perhaps the most challenging battle during our time together was lost on neither of us. Either opponent could have thrown us in for a loop on their own. My father was the biggest concern, of course, but I had seen enough of Rina Tanaka in action to know that she was going to be a handful. Both of them worried me, of course, but nowhere near as much as losing control over the nether void and the catastrophic outcome that would ensue if such a thing were to occur. I began. Say no more, Sherry, he said. I fully recognize the quandary we are in. We have to make sure the people in the building are safe. Any ideas? I asked. Not at the moment. But I'm sure something will come to you or me during this battle. I said, turning to Death with as serious a look as I could muster. You know I can't maintain my void for more than 10 minutes. How long can you hold out, all things constant? I can hold out for days. And what about when facing off against our current adversaries? Then Sherry, all bets are off, I sighed. That's what I thought. What about a reverse nether void? That wouldn't make much sense, Sherry, said Death. Not unless you want to reveal to the entire building what you and I are about. I didn't get a chance to respond. Rina moved rapidly toward me, her dark blade flashing in the sunlight, moving in several places at once. Her speed was terrifying, making her lone katana appear to be hundreds of dancing scimitars, the cold steel flickering in the light of the sun, at once graceful, alluring, and equally deadly. The last time I faced Rina, her technique had been impressive, but the nanosuit had altered her already perfect form, making it far more unpredictable. To make matters worse, Rina was now several orders of magnitude faster. The sword was unrelenting in its attack, the blade striking in 1,000 different directions. Far more impressive, however, was the fact that a human being was able to move in the presence of a nether void. Remarkably, the nanomachines were eroding the powerful and debilitating field that Death and I had cast over the building, completely nullifying its effects. Still, it wasn't as though I couldn't keep up. My experience with the Class Ds combined with the power that I had gained from making my scythe stronger, and my added edge with the Van Dyke magic ensured that I was equally as unpredictable as either of our opponents. I parried the attack as well as I could under the circumstances. At the very least, my eyes were able to see the individual movements of Rina's blade. I could see the deadly edge as it approached, and I could anticipate the angle of her strikes. She leapt up, catapulting herself above me before diving straight down. The significance of the move wasn't lost on me. It was the same attack I attempted when I faced her for the first time in Jackson Square, when the rain fell down from the heavens and my emotions were in turmoil. I could see the smirk on Rina's face as she reached the apex of her somersault. She was attempting the exact same move that very nearly cost me my life. She was showing me that she could do what I couldn't. As she approached me from above, I could see Katsujinkan. Her blade was arced in an odd manner. I realized that she meant for me to parry the blade. She had something else in mind. It was time for a surprise of my own. Distarnis Talanas Saknas Fartan, I said as I cast a giant barrier of light around me. Katsujinkan struck the barrier, but moved harmlessly out of the way. The barrier I erected had saved me. Rina landed just a few feet in front of me, a look of disgust on her face. I'm not the same as I was back then, I said to Rina. You would do well not to underestimate me. In the same instant, Donovan Hunter moved, his speed blinding as he flexed his wings and took to the air. Things just got a lot more interesting, Sherry, said Death, his red eyes looking out at the sky at Donovan Hunter, who was now hovering just outside the building. Listen to me closely. There's something I need to teach you. It's going to have to wait until I can get rid of the crazy sword lady. I said this barrier I've erected won't hold. No, Vanessa, unfortunately it can't. Well then how do we do this, I said. We'll have to find a way to distract your opponent. And mine, how about this? In response, hundreds of mini-scythes appeared all around us. I don't think I quite saw that many during our battle with Azazel. That is an impressive amount of mini-scythes, I said. Yes, it is costly in terms of my power, but we need this diversion to work. Death pointed toward Rina and Donovan, and the scythes all moved toward the direction of our opponents. Knowing our adversaries, that probably buys us at best a few minutes. But it's plenty enough for me to explain something. Rina was now parrying away like mad, darting in several directions. The mini-scythes were relentless, and the sheer number of them would have been all but the most seasoned of opponents away. Still, we were not up against unintelligent Class D vampires. Our opponents were skilled and highly intelligent. Donovan played with the mini-scythes for a little while, dodging a few and letting a few cut into him, intentionally letting the blades poke holes through his body, which regenerated the damage in seconds. How many souls have you reaped so far? Death's question brought my attention back to the present. I've got a little over 50, I said. My haven't we been busy, said Death D. In case you haven't noticed, now's not exactly the time to be cracking the one-liners. I said, ever the impatient one, aren't we, Vanessa? Okay, Sherry, listen up then. With 50 souls reaped, it's more than enough to open your secondary form. Come again, the power of death comes in many levels. Sherry, but you unlock those levels. You have to unlock certain gates. Each gate safeguards a particular ability. To open the second gate, you have to listen to me closely. I listened with rapt attention as Death shared his secrets with me. Part of me wished I had the time to listen back when things were simpler. I knew that my recklessness was partly to blame. Still, Vanessa Hunter wasn't exactly known for following the rules. I would do things my way. And if this latest development was what I needed to overcome the current odds that I faced, then I would roll with the punches and push forward. Okay, I understand what you've told me. So opening the second gate does exactly what for me. That's simple, Sherry. In an aerial battle, you'll need to be able to fly without my assistance. Unlocking the next phase of your powers will allow you to do just that, said Death. I breathed in deep. Okay, here goes. I waved the scythe in front of me, following Death's instructions as best I could. I then took my scythe and made a small incision on my wrist, slashing it across, drawing blood from it. Blood flowed from the open wound, but I stopped the flow with my left hand and uttered several words, the key phrases that I learned from Death, the key things that were needed to unlock my second form. Power coursed through me once more, far more than I had known before. I felt something behind me, a force that threatened to muscle its way out of my body, an almost uncomfortable, persistent feeling. I knew what it was, of course. I felt the weight of newfound abilities and new form. I felt the wings sprout out from behind me, forcing their way from muscle and bone, taking shape far quicker than I could ever react. Oddly enough, I felt no pain. When all was said and done, I flexed my wings as the air around me was displaced. Congratulations, Vanessa, said Death. Now you are truly worthy of the name Death Angel. Things are heating up. What do you guys think is going to happen next? Vote and comment, add to your library. I'll do my best to keep delivering the action. Thanks for everyone's support.